On this 8th Sunday in Ordinary Time, we almost finished the Sermon on the Plain. There's one more section, one more teaching. But unfortunately, because Lent begins on Wednesday, please help us, we're going to switch our gospel reading. So next week, in the first Sunday of Lent, we're going to be in a totally different section. And this happens every year. We're going through one of the Gospels chronologically. Ash Wednesday comes, we stop. Then we have different readings all through Lent, different readings all through Easter until Pentecost. But then the church always does this thing. Right after Pentecost, we have Trinity Sunday, and then we'll have Corpus Christi. Those two celebrations will replace the 9th and the 10th Sunday in Ordinary Time, which means even though in July, June, we'll come back to St. Luke, we're going to come back in a different part. We're going to skip the end of the Sermon on the Plain. So I thought today it'd be good if we look at the whole Sermon on the Plain and see what can we gather from what we heard this morning. So if we remember 2 weeks ago, we heard the beginning of the Sermon on the Plain, the 4 blessings and the 4 woes. Just like the Sermon on the Mount in St. Matthew's Gospel, which begins with the 9 Beatitudes, Jesus is acting as a prophet. He's giving a prophetic utterance. Remember what he quoted in the synagogue earlier in the Gospel. He quoted the prophet Isaiah. I have come to bring glad tidings to the poor. What was the first blessing? Blessed are the poor, for the kingdom of God is theirs. Woe to the rich, for they have received their reward. This goes beyond human knowledge. We look and we see, no, the poor aren't blessed and the rich are blessed, but Jesus is saying, no, God elevates things. He reverses human standards. Having established himself as a prophet like that of Moses and Isaiah, he then gives a moral teaching, just like Moses and Isaiah did. And flowing from his prophetic identity, he lets us know that morality has a very high standard. Don't treat people in kind. Don't treat them as they treat you. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Bless those who insult you. Give to those without expecting repayment. When one seeks your cloak, do not withhold from him even your tunic. When one presses you into service for a mile, go with him for 2 miles. And so Jesus' moral teaching is that we treat each other as God treats us, not as we deserve. Because God lets the sun shine on the wicked and the unjust, as well as the good and the just. Then we get to our gospel this morning, and St. Luke says something that's supposed to perk our ears. It's a break in the moral teaching, St. Luke says, and then Jesus told them a parable. But if you listened this morning, that wasn't a parable. It's not, a parable's a story, like the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. These are more just metaphor, analogies, they're metaphors. And so what is the first metaphor that Jesus uses? Can a blind person lead a blind person? No disciple is greater than his master. And then he says, why do you try to remove the splinter from your brother's eye when you have a beam in your own? You hypocrites. That's the key. Who else has Jesus called hypocrites in St. Luke's gospel, earlier in the gospel? The Pharisees. He's done it twice already. Those are the blind leading the blind. Those are the ones who have great, massive sins, yet are constantly pointing out the smaller sins of others. And what does Jesus say about them? Earlier in Luke's gospel, he said, they lay heavy burdens on the backs of the people, but do not lift a finger to help them. After he invokes the memory of the hypocrites, the memory of the Pharisees, he says, A tree is known by its fruit. A rotten tree does not produce good fruit. A good tree does not produce rotten fruit. Every tree is known by its own fruit. The whole point of what we heard this morning is Jesus is giving us a contrast of authority. The Pharisees claim authority over the Torah. Jesus claims authority over the Torah. The Pharisees claim to be in line with the prophets. Jesus claims to be in the continuation of the prophets. The Pharisees provide moral teachings. Jesus provides moral teachings. Who are we to believe? What do these two produce in the world? That is the standard by which we are to know. That is the measure by which we are to measure. Remember last week. Stop judging and you will not be judged. Give and more will be given to you. A good measure, packed together, shaken down and overflowing. The best possible outcome. Well, if it's true, we should look and see the good that is produced by this teaching. So what do the Pharisees produce? What do their teachings bring about in the world? Fear, burden, suffering, but for themselves, enrichment, prestige, honor. What does Jesus produce in this world? Sacrifice, forgiveness of sins, resurrection. And then his disciples, what do? They become like their teacher. They go out to all the world, spread the good news, and establish the church. Where's the fruit that Jesus produces? It's you. 2,000 years later, you got up on a Sunday morning and came here. Because Jesus Christ has produced some good in your heart, and you recognize it, and you want more of it, and you want to do worship and honor towards the one who has produced good in your life. And that's what Jesus says the final measure is. The Sermon on the Plain ends, which we won't hear, with the saying we've all heard. Why do you call me good teacher when you do not do what I tell you? He who hears my word and acts on it is like the one who built his house upon the rock. The storms came, the rivers burst, and his house was unmoved because it had been built upon strong foundation. But he who hears my word and does not act on it is like the fool who built his house upon the sand. The storms came, the rivers burst, and his home was washed away because it lacked foundation. Those who have ears ought to hear. When the storms of life, when the destruction of the world, when the evil that permeates all around us comes for you, you will remain unshaken. Because not only did you hear the words of Jesus and say, oh, that's nice, oh, that's good, you said, I want to live it. I want to produce the good that he produces continually today. I want to be a disciple who is like his teacher. Well, brothers and sisters, then we have to live out the teaching. High standard though they are, we have to live it out on faith. And see what happens. And see when the storms come, because they're coming. The banks of the river aren't going to hold forever. The day only lasts so long, but it will always give way to the night. And we will be tested, and we will suffer, and evil will be brought upon us in any number of ways. If we only listen to the word of Jesus, in that moment, we will be destroyed because we lack foundation. But if we live out this teaching on faith, difficult as it is, loving our enemies, giving to others, sacrificing, not for my benefit, but for your benefit, for the benefit of the other, I will see the good that is produced in my life. I will see that my house stands firm against the winds. And then I will know Jesus is the good teacher. And little by little, he's making me like